Got it.
Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah with the Midwest Writing Center, and I'm super excited to talk to you today about our forthcoming anthology. I'm prepared, but not prepared enough. These interesting times. And we're meeting today with the women who made it happen. We have Misty Urban and Susan Collins, and we'll talk more about who they are and what they do in a moment. But in general, for folks who may be new to watching, we're going to have this interview probably 40 minutes, maybe 45. It's okay if it's shorter or longer, but I want to prepare you if you're trying to camp in your seat for the episode. After that, we'll talk about things that are new and exciting with the Midwest Writing Center outside of the anthology, and then a 5-minute free write. So let's get into it. Misty, Susan, thank you so much for being here with me today. I've heard you both talk about the anthology before, but every time I do, I get excited about the anthology. And I thought that would be a really great way to introduce it to the rest of the world. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess let's get into it. Susan, you are, this is your brainchild, right? It was your idea? How did that happen? How'd you get the idea?
Well, as a former history teacher, and I also could say old history teacher, because both are accurate, I believe deeply in the importance of recording and preserving what we do, what we believe, what we experience, and what we value. And this is true for our families, it's true for our communities, it's true for our world. And 2020 was obviously a very unusual year for our world and for specifically our area. And I think it deserves to be recorded for posterity. So I brought it up as an idea at the program committee of the Midwest Writing Center. And fortunately, some talented people picked up on the idea and worked very hard to have it become a reality.
As a very talented person, Misty, do you have a response or
I'm trying to remember exactly when we had the discussion and Sue first floated this idea. We were all knee deep in the pandemic. I think we'd kind of emerged from lockdown. It might have even been the fall, because I remember at some point I was sitting in the car to be on this Zoom meeting watching my kids play soccer. So it must have been fall 2020. And 6 months in, we didn't know what was happening. We were already tired. And when Sue said, we should just have people talk about this, have writers talk about this, I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. And I like to make books. I like to write books. I like to edit books, and I like to publish books. And so my initial thought was, well, what if we do an anthology and we do a call for proposals and we ask people to submit and we publish it through the Midwest Writing Center Press? Wouldn't that be a fun idea? And as so often happens, as Sue can tell you in these programming committees, not many people say no. Like, they won't stop you. If you come up with an idea, they try to make it happen. That's really exciting. It's such a great group of people to work with. So I went ahead, like I do, full steam, and drafted a call for proposals. And we spent a lot of time, Sarah, you can attest to this, and Sue, you too, kind of crafting that proposal, because we were talking about it in our heads as the disaster anthology. Let's do a disaster anthology, and we're already sad. And somebody kept saying, the idea kept coming up, why do we want to make people sad? Why do we want to focus on disasters? Can we focus on what's coming out of the disaster? And so that kind of became the target and the hope. And we crafted our language in the proposal to ask for these stories. And we also knew we didn't want 25 or 40 people saying, this is what I did during lockdown. That could be interesting, but that wasn't the scope of it. It came out pretty early in our discussions that a lot more was going on in 2020. There was this bitter political divisiveness. You could just see it. You could feel it. Black Lives Matter was finally getting some traction. Like, finally people were noticing there's a real problem with how many Black people are being killed at the hands of police. There were protests. There were murder hornets. Who brought the murder hornets? I mean, there was just so much. And it seemed to me that it would just be really interesting to get those personal inside stories. I mean, anybody you talk to had something else going on, something different they were experiencing. So that became our call. Tell us what 2020 was like for you. So that's how we phrased the call for proposals. And I think we started it, I think we launched that in November or December and had people submit by the end of January. And our biggest fear, which is funny to think now, was that, oh, by the time people write their thing in January and send it, this will all be over. And by the time the book comes out, it will all seem so far away. And yet, that is not going to be the case. It's still very, very relevant which is both fortunate for our publication schedule and yet very sad in real life.
We can have a series of them. So you said something that I wanted to touch on and also get Sue's take, which is everyone you talked to talked about surviving something. And we have these flashbulb moments in history, right? The JFK assassination, 9/11, where we all have this, well, here's where I was when this happened. But when it spans over a year, things take a different shape, certainly a narrative one, because we can start to see how each moment, weaved into the next one. Is that, I mean, I've read it, so I know that that comes through, but was that expected? What did you two expect when you announced that this was a real thing?
Sue, go ahead. I want to hear what you were thinking.
Well, I probably expected more people talking about being more negative than what I think it actually came out to be. And that was a good thing. And talking about the different ways that they coped with situations, not just the pandemic, but the other things that were happening as well. And I think what the end product is really a wonderful composite of so much what was going on individually and in the world and everything else, and not necessarily just as Misty talked about, a disaster anthology, but we want also to show that there's a resilience there, and I think that happened.
Yeah, for sure. I know I went about soliciting some people and asking them to write pieces. And even in that process early on, I saw a potential for really a wide variety of things. One person I talked to was going to try to launch a novel and right around the time of lockdown, and then got a cancer diagnosis. And so for reasons of many things, one of them being treatment for cancer, she didn't end up writing and submitting that essay. And, I miss that essay. I hope she writes it at some point. But you could tell early on, these were going to be really unique windows. And when I started reading submissions, I was really excited and really glad that we turned it into a whatever your perspective is. We asked for art, we asked for poetry, we asked for hybrid. We wanted to hear people's different voices. And I was concerned that, we would hear a lot of COVID stories. And there could be a certain sameness to that, but that's not what happened. What we got were these really individual, unique looks into people's lives. So some of them in the essays span the year and are chronological. Karen Musser-Nortman's essay about, she lost her husband quite early in 2020, and everybody said to her, no, don't isolate yourself. She's a widow, her kids are all far away. Don't isolate yourself. And then a month later, the whole world is in lockdown. So she writes about bearing that grief in a time when you don't have the support system that you should have. Teresa Giglio-Voss wrote a really neat perspective. She wrote about her year and the challenges of the year and how she met them, but she was looking at it from somebody who had chosen to be in Iowa and had chosen to be in the specific place near her family. And then the world, goes dark. There's a derecho, there's different family members getting sick. She covers the whole year, but it's from a really unique perspective of how she kind of learned to live in Iowa. Monica Flink's essay is about having a near-death experience, like a devastating medical emergency, non-COVID related. So here she is in a hospital, and you can see around it, she's surrounded by really sick people, and she's facing death for an entirely different reason. Shushan Collins wrote a wonderful essay too, and her title will grab you. What a lucky year. So she was publishing her debut novel. She was really excited about what 2020 was going to bring. And so she writes about how different those expectations were. So that was really neat to get kind of the long view. But I also love the pieces that are really short, the poets who are just capturing this moment that kind of distills the isolation and the fear and the new perspective. There's a lot of really beautiful imagery going on when people who have been forced to step back from the world can look at it more closely, and they just dwell in those moments that frankly have a lot of beauty. So I was really excited, even in early submissions, about how many pieces were sharing the same voice and sharing the same struggle, and then contributing in a really unique way to a perspective of what people in our area had experienced. It was marvelous. I like it.
So you touched on a few things that I had lined up to ask about. So I'm gonna just
good
into that. Which is, we got a handful of timeline pieces, which were very, very different from each other, which I think is really cool and unexpected for me. I just if I were gonna write a timeline of 2020, yeah, I probably would have been like, January and February would probably be different from other people, but after that and then we locked down, and then we struggled, and here we are, right? So what do you, can you talk to me about, and you talked about a couple of them, the pieces, and Susan, I don't know if you've actually read it. Have you read it?
I've read all of the pieces when we were deciding, doing an editorial discussion.
So I tried to keep myself a little bit in the dark about what would end up being in there, just so I didn't like skim read, because you can't do that as anyone in the editorial process. But what do you think? This is maybe like a psychological question. So I will acknowledge and recognize that I don't think any of us have any kind of degree in that area. But what do you think, why do you think that is, that we have so many timelines? And also, I can speak to this in case I'm like way too leading with this question, like, why is that so special? What leads us to think of things that way? And I'm just going to say what I think. I think the cool result of having so many timelines is learning how different we are as people, despite going through so much of the same. But I would like to touch on, since you were already ready for it, Misty, at least, and Susan, I'd love your take as well. Can you talk about how different those timeline pieces are? I'll see if I can tell by the titles which ones are which. We've got What a Lucky Year. You mentioned Terry Voss's piece. I think it's called like a year in the life or something. Yeah, those two are both, relatively comfortable Midwestern women, right? And they're still such different years.
It's funny, and I don't know if this is true, but we have a good balance in the anthology of personal essays that are just focused around a certain theme, like Tom Lerzak's Walking. And it's just about that. It's about walking. Really nicely formed personal essay, really complete. I'm glancing at names too. Dylan Parker has just a really moving personal essay about losing his dad. And
and Carolyn Rambo has a timeline.
Yeah, so I want to touch on Carrie's piece in a second, because she takes a unique view of that timeline. So what I noticed from the people that I'm familiar with their work, the long form fiction writers chose a sort of memoir approach. They chose that kind of let's think through this whole year and make meaning out of it. So, Karen chooses her theme, and it's about grief and the things she did to handle her grief. And Terry chooses her theme, and it's about dealing with these natural and personal disasters. Shushren chooses her theme, which is about, focusing on her book and the choices she made to change her career so she could be more available to her family. But then you have Carolyn Rambo's piece. And so she goes month by month, and she gives you a kind of calendar in this really wonderful voice from her totally unique perspective. So she writes as a parent, she writes as someone going through or wanting to go through job transition, and she writes from somebody who's not white, who's watching Black Lives Matter and is watching, what's happening to people of color all around. So she's kind of got this really staccato, take no prisoners approach to it. And that adds so much, because it's such a nice contrast in tension and an outlook to the sort of slower and meandering pieces that we have. Julia Marie Barr's disaster piece, which is a hybrid. She picks certain kind of months and looks back at them. Some she looks back with kind of prose reflections, some she looks at poetically. And she doesn't focus on what's happening so much as the feeling. April, isolation lost its luster. July, retreat and rearrange. August, solo mission. She kind of hints at what's going on in the outside world, but the timeline focuses on what's inside. So it's partly a reflection of the sensibility of these different writers and the approach they take and what they focus on. Frank Mullen's Pandiary, I have to tell you, this was almost an automatic no for me, because the first paragraph talks about the political atmosphere. And I'm like, I don't think we want to do that. I don't think we want to rile people, but then I kept in there because he has this great and engaging voice. And I realized he's dry satire. So he's looking again at the timeline. This is what happened in the year. This is what happened from the perspective of somebody who's a little bit older, watching everything get canceled inside of what he's calling this larger cancel culture, political movement. And ultimately, it's the voices that are so different that lead to these really interesting perspectives. And when you put them together, you just get so much out of it. So much.
I'm just going to list a few different ones. I want to say Amy Penn's essay on comfort food is also a timeline, but not not at first glance.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Turner and what's his name? I don't have it in front of me. Brian Fox Ellis, is that his name?
Yeah. So Jonathan and Brian both talk about being professionals. Jonathan Turner is a professional journalist, and Brian Fox Ellis a professional storyteller and entertainer. So their pieces were really similar in how they talked about dealing with professional challenges in and amongst the personal. So that was a unique perspective too.
For sure.
Sorry, back to you, Sarah. I keep jumping in because I'm so excited to talk about these pieces.
Susan, did any of the timeline pieces appeal to you in any particular way or catch you off guard?
Not really. I'm kind of a timeline person with the history background, so I like things that go in a pattern. And you mentioned both the Dylan Parker piece and the Frank Mullen. They particularly stood out, I think, in that way for me.
Yeah, honestly, surprisingly, this is surprising to me. I think if we had a whole book of just people documenting month by month, I would be down for it. Which from the outside kind of sounds boring, but it can't be because we all went through general chaos and shenanigans, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ultimately, I think that's the fun of this book, because, and this is, spoiler alert, this is what I put in the editorial note. I focused on how alone I had felt. And then when I read these pieces, I was reminded we were all in this together, but everybody's experience was so different because our personalities are different, challenges are different, our perspectives are different. So in a way, I think this volume really gets at what Sue was looking for, a historical document, but it's also a way of kind of creating relationship and validating what you went through. You weren't alone. Somebody in the next boat over, you couldn't talk to them, you couldn't reach them, but they were feeling it too. And they were right there with you the whole time.
And that's honestly like a whole interesting thing about isolation in general, isn't it?
Mhm.
I'm going to leave that thought because it is not relevant. Um, something that I know is important to the two of you in the beginning, I'm sure still today, but when you both presented this idea and it was my job to market it, right? So I um I had to really consider what this means because most of the time things we do at the Writing Center are for writers. And you were both pretty specific about this being open to not people who call themselves capital W writers. Can you each speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think that we wanted to get the voices, we wanted to get the stories of those people. They all have stories. And if you can get them to share those stories, that's really, really valuable for me anyway.
Yeah, our hope, I shared that too. Our hope was to cast a really wide net, and we were willing to do whatever, you know, emotional labor, physical labor, editorial help was necessary. We wanted to bring out the non-writers. I have found in the anthologies I put together for Writers on the Avenue, notice how I slipped in the plug for WOTA there, some of the pieces that we pulled out of non-writers about their experience. And, you know, with a little literary shaping, they are just as powerful stories at their core. And then you figure out how to get them on the page so they speak to readers as well. We were hoping, quite frankly, that we would be able to get more of that. But I think the people who are not writers by habit or by trade had more barriers to sitting down and getting their story out there, or other avenues for telling their story, which I hope.
I'm really glad you said that. That was something I was going to ask about and couldn't really figure out the phrasing for. But I think that there are, particularly with, people who maybe, like I said, the phrasing is difficult. People who maybe went through more or harder, because you can't, I mean, this isn't the trauma Olympics, right? I never want to compare our pain and call one worse. The people who really went through a lot likely had some barriers to expressing that too, because when you document something, it can be cathartic, but it can also be re-triggering. And so I notice, well, we have a huge spread of voices in here based on any kind of social, racial, economic class. I always say don't list kinds of people, and then I do it. We have a huge variety of people from all sorts of backgrounds, but there are some voices that are missing. And what I've wondered is if that's because those stories are harder to tell. For example, I know a handful of the people in this book, and I'm very blessed to know so many excellent people. And I noticed the really tough parts of their stories are also not part of the stories they chose to tell. So yeah, so there are some barriers.
I think distance too is a factor when you're telling a story. Speaking of triggering, if you're in the middle of not having housing, if you were in the middle of acute mental anguish, if you were in the middle, if you're hooked up to a ventilator, it's hard to tell your story. So I wonder sometimes if it just wasn't the right timing for some stories. They needed a little more distance because, you look at it, when our idea came up, when our call went out, there wasn't enough time to really process. Even I, who had the luxury of writing my editorial note, in spring when things had calmed down a little bit and vaccines were becoming available, I still felt like this is really close and this is going to be a really raw story. And maybe there's a benefit to that too. But in time, I hope those stories do get told. I think, I keep tooting this horn. This is such a wonderful window into what is happening on the inside when you can't talk to people, what's going on inside of their lives. But I think we still need a fuller picture, and I hope that continues to emerge. Maybe another book.
Do you have any Any response to that, Susan?
Did you freeze, Sue?
She's not frozen. I don't,
Oh, okay.
but I don't want to put pressure on you. Yeah, I know you sort of
Well, I
joking.
think it's a really good point. I think there's going to be,
I guess she did freeze. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you there. But you know, maybe you know, we really wanted to be timely about this. We wanted to be I say we, it was the two of you. And you know, capture this snapshot and document it in real time. But I think you're right that probably a revisiting, something with reflective windows just drove by my window. A revisiting might be a really beautiful and important thing to document too, right? I mean, we do that now with all the histories we're realizing we're losing, right? Holocaust survivors, for example. We really need to document this before we can't anymore. So
World
maybe,
War II veterans. I just read a memoir from a World War II veteran, and I thought, you know, there aren't too many more people who are going to be able to tell these stories. You know, as the writer, I always think of the reader who's sitting here reading this book, and I imagine the delight they would feel at seeing their own experience on the page. But also, Sarah, you've been planning such wonderful readings and events. And, you know, those aren't just to tell people about the book, those are to create community where people can come forward and tell their stories and share their stories. So I'm hoping that the launch of this book will create kind of an ongoing real-time conversation. And maybe there are pieces in it at readings or elsewhere, you know, later on, that people will be able to come forward with their own story and maybe be given a perspective that they needed, or the language that they needed, or the tools that they needed, or the friend that they needed. I'm excited to see what can come out of some of those events.
and I actually credit Sue with putting this bug in my head. I'm not great at idioms.
Sue is full of good ideas, and she manages, like, they take wings because you just want to act and make them happen.
But storytelling as a craft of the people, right? Rather than this, for folks who are, you know, involved in the literary community, it's often a very highbrow and difficult to access place to be. But ensuring that this is a documentation of life rather than of, you know, the folks who were in the writing programs at the time is also really important. And I'm grateful that you made that requirement, the two of you.
And that it's a documentation of survival and hope and resilience and humor. There's so much humor in this book. There's so many beautiful captured moments. It really is not a tale of woe.
I'm trying to remember because I mentioned, and by trying to remember, I mean looking on my computer, because I mentioned, you know, you brought this forward and the board was so excited about it, rightfully so. And when I went about the marketing thing, the thing I wrote on all of the graphics said 2020 was a disaster. What's your story? Something like that. And I'm trying to remember specifically / searching specifically for it, because I think that you insisted that there was something about what did you survive or what did you learn or something, because it is dark. It is dark.
Yeah, that came again, I think, out of those discussions where we were looking forward into the usefulness of it. And the purpose of telling this story was going to be, in some respects, cathartic for the writer or the artist. The poet, it was going to be informative for the reader. It was going to be a historical record. But, you know, we wanted to bring hope. We're going to get through this. We're going to make it. Look what we've done already. It's kind of a a documentation of the area too, the kind of Midwest grit, if you'll allow that term. You know, derecho, your power's out, you get out the chainsaw, you cut down the limbs, you walk over to your neighbors, you cut down their limbs, you know, somebody brings in the water, you spread out the water. I like that about this area. That impulse to help maybe, or that impulse to reach out. We felt it strongly, even though we were told, you know, 6 feet away, don't get close.
I found the image, and I'm gonna share the screen in a moment.
Good.
But let's go back to me asking you questions. So the variety of stories in here, formally also changes a lot. We mentioned that a little bit with a couple of the what I called timeline pieces, but in that, you know, there were like hybrid pieces. We have some that had poetry in the middle of them, or were broken down into lists. But it's interesting too how, you know, many of the essays were timelines. Here's what happened in January. Here's what happened in March. Here's what happened in April. I forgot the month after March. I apologize. But then with the short fiction, with the poetry, we have a couple of the epistolaries. Those are very different. Can you speak to how those little, I say little, I mean size wise they're small, not in purpose or meaning, how those snapshots work to inform the anthology?
I always have lots to say, but I'd love to hear what Sue thinks about these submissions.
As far as, it's been a while since I've had the opportunity to read through them. But I mean, I just was very delighted with the great variety of topics, types of writing, types of storytelling, all of that. I don't know if that answers your question, but Misty, you've been hands-on much more than I have. So what do you have to say about that?
One thing that the shorter pieces provide, and the more poetic, the hybrid pieces, the epistolary pieces, are a different pace, a different breathing space, and a different kind of tension. And that adds a really necessary variety to some of the bigger perspectives and some of the longer prose pieces. And when I was deciding how to put this collection together, because I had that I had that gift, I had that opportunity, I realized pretty quickly that I was in no way capable of trying to organize it on the basis of chronology. That wasn't going to work. And it wasn't going to work to organize it as a kind of pacing, because altogether the moods were just so different. And I didn't want to put all the poetry together, and I don't want to put all the prose together, because that would ruin the conversation between the pieces. So I finally defaulted to the good old standby that movie producers use when they have a star-studded cast and they don't want to start any arguments. They go alphabetically. The tactic that we teachers use when we have a room full of people and we don't know them and we don't know their personalities and who's going to get along. I'll seat you alphabetically and we'll sort it out later. So I went alphabetically, and in the kind of happy serendipitous circumstance that happens, it worked perfectly, because it is a conversation. There is such a rhythm. And sometimes you have pieces that it feels like they've taken up the thought that an earlier piece left off. And sometimes you have pieces that are completely different harmonic tone in the chorus, and they're coming forward and they're saying something else. So quite accidentally, we have really dark outlooks next to really still, small moments. And then we have long, luxurious, thoughtful pieces. Some of them that we accepted, some groups of poems talk really well together. You get this, you kind of fall into this rhythmic style. I really liked that. Sarah, I believe Sarah Marock's work. No, am I getting her name wrong? Where'd you go?
There is a
Yes, Sarah Mock's work. I really liked that. Emily Kingery's poems, all three of them. Philip Sturt's poems, David Wright's poems, together, those groups do so much. They talk so well together. That's orchestrated by the poet, but then the way they talk to the other pieces in the volume and establish a different harmony there. It just got really lucky. The fiction pieces, I was so happy to get some fiction because it's kind of hard to make fiction out of this kind of thing. So we only have really two that I know of, but that's wonderful. And then our pieces that are more letters, like Room and Row is writing to her mother who's gone. Sarah, your piece, in writing to a friend. Mary David Saver's piece, so she's writing to a grandchild that she's not going to be able to hold, that she's going to watch her first year over Zoom. Those add a different sort of intimacy and a personal voice and a personal engagement that in the end just created this lovely symphony of sound that I really love.
After reading the rest of this, and I put this in the chat on Facebook, but we're holding up proof copies, so the book is not out yet. You're not missing out yet. But these are early copies that we used to make sure that everything was good. But after reading it, I, as a whole, as a collection, I felt really silly about what I contributed. Not I wanted to be part of this, of course, so I submitted and let your wonderful group judge me. But it was so early, and I think maybe we had heard of Murder Hornets, but I was just immediately responding to something when I wrote it that was present in that moment, and reading the rest of this, I'm like, oh, but there's so much more. So yeah. Besides responding on my own behalf, I want to say, you mentioned the conversation that these pieces have together, and I think that is really interesting and really true, because we don't have true intertextuality here, right? I'm not responding to your letter to the editor, which I suppose actually is responding to the pieces, but bear with me. These pieces are not responding to each other, but they are in conversation with each other because they're all part of the same universe, which coincidentally is the real world that we're living in. But it's not what you see, in big classic anthologies of early 20th century literature or whatever. These pieces are in conversation, but they are not familiar with one another, and that's another interesting thing. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to share my screen to make fun of my my advert, but
Not at all.
I'm going to ask Susan a question. Somehow I've forgotten how to press the big green button. Now, Susan, you made sure that we used this opportunity to there we go. It doesn't have to be a disaster story. Stop that share. Just wanted to see how far we've come. Now, you made sure that we in some local disaster relief with any proceeds we may see. Can you speak to that for a moment?
Well, you're referring to the Quad City Community Foundation's Disaster Relief Fund, and they were instrumental in helping so many people during 2020 and continue to do so. So I reached out to, excuse me, to them and told them about the project. And that at that point, we didn't really know if we'd even have anybody submitting or anything else, but they found it very, very interesting. And I said, if we are fortunate enough to have made some funds from the sale of the book, that we would be honored to be able to donate some of those funds to the Quad City Disaster Relief Fund. And they were very happy about that. And I just updated them within the last 2 weeks. And they're excited to see the finished product. And I asked them if they might be able to, in some way, market the book their clients and their donors, and they're working on that. I don't have an answer for that right now, but we're hoping that there'll be some funds that we can aim in that direction.
I think that's so important, and I'm so grateful that you insisted on that, because if we're going to engage with this moment in time without, you know, we can't engage with this moment in time without engaging with, you know, the sad parts. We can document something, but if we're not going to, you know, admit and try to be part of a solution, then it feels a little silly. So I'm very, very grateful to you for that. Misty, I understand that you have writers groups, that you have students, that you are a reader. And as such, I understand that you're a reader. Do you read?
No, this is a backdrop.
Oh, the joke there is that that's not actually a backdrop. It does look like one, but those are real books. It
That
does
is also my elliptical that's occasionally sticking out of my head.
too. It's too good. It's too good. All the books, just my books are messy.
I don't know, but we love them
We play
nevertheless.
of book groups, like book conversation groups or book clubs. Can you tell me some about why that would be so cool
Why people should join book clubs or writers groups?
for this book in particular?
For this book, yeah, this is where, well, our larger point, to follow up on Sue's, what Sue had mentioned earlier, we do want the book to be community building. It was meant to be a community of its own, and we hope that it will establish community. I do want to take this 1 second to shout out to other sponsors who have helped make this book possible. Philip Kuning, attorney at law, the Illinois Arts Council was helping out the MWC, Illinois Humanities, the Poetry Foundation gave a big grant to MWC in part, which will help support this book. And the book is at the printers right now. It's coming out in print, we hope, by the end of October. Obviously, the publishing world being what it is, supply chains being what they are, and the world still being a bit volatile, you know, that may turn out to be an optimistic projection, but that's what we're hoping. And for the print copies, we want to thank Total Printing Systems, our printer, for sponsoring some of our print run. And we want to thank Legacy Book Press, LLC, for sponsoring complimentary copies for our contributors. So, ways to put this book in conversation. I would love to see this not only become in libraries, local libraries, but become a center of events where we can get other people talking about it. I personally would think it would be a great book club book because there is something for everyone. You don't like a piece, you skim it and you move on to the next. The variety is such an appealing part of it. Sarah, you've been hard at work scheduling readings and promotional events throughout. You know, we're hoping to sell books there, we're hoping to put it in people's hands, and we're hoping that they'll be able to run with it elsewhere and kind of start their own conversations. I don't know, maybe the book will have its own fan page, its own Facebook group in time, its own legacy. Maybe it will just inspire more stories or more stories like this. But I want to hear those stories.
You are floating the idea of a future anthology. We did have a response to that in the chat over here on Facebook. Oh, we've got a lot of stuff going on. Yes, the title of the book is These Interesting Times. I'm holding it up. I don't know how much of me is visible.
It might be backwards.
I don't
backwards.
think so. No, it's
My
correct.
camera switched it. Okay. This is the Figge, by the way. It's a viewpoint from the Figge Museum looking toward the river and the bridge.
Oh yeah, not super visible in the video, I think. I'll upload a photo to this chat here too.
Okay.
Yeah, no, somebody responded favorably that, like, yeah, they really wanted to contribute, but life was happening as it is wont to do. And that, you know, revisiting this later could be very, very helpful to a lot of us. Probably
I do too.
everyone in this video, but certainly to many people outside the world. And I think that as a book group, a book club, I don't know why I keep saying book group as if that's a thing that people talk about, or I mean, a term that people use. I think that too can be really cathartic, after the first round of proofs, when the two of us, Misty, spoke about it, I felt like I was, I don't know, gaining clarity on this year that isn't over, right? We joked before we went live that this is 2020 part 2. But we're still in it. We're in the thick of it. We're trying really hard to go back to what we think life is supposed to be like. But all of the things that happened last year, their effects are long term, and some of them are ongoing. So I think, in just the conversations I've been lucky enough to have around this book, I have found a lot of healing, a lot of catharsis. And so I really hope that folks are able to share it with other humans so that they can have those moments as well. It's wholly different to read a book alone, versus reading it with someone to talk about or talk with about it. I'm just not wording well today. I apologize, everyone.
You're doing great.
Okay, we've got.
If I might add one thing concerning that, if I've had really some wonderful experiences by inviting friends of mine to come and talk about a local publication and perhaps the authors there, and where they can interact with the author. And I think this opportunity for people who are contributors, maybe some of their friends would like to have them come and talk about their work and the work of others, or just a nice evening together where you are talking about the book. And it doesn't have to be a formal book club. It could just be friends that you're getting together.
Thank you. Actually, thank you a lot for adding that, because if you put the words book club together, I'm like immediately afraid of joining. It's something about, I don't know, executive dysfunction or something. You tell me that something's expected of me and I'm like, okay, can't do it. So yeah, thank you so much for adding that, Sue. I think really having the opportunity to talk about it is powerful. And like anytime you and a friend share a book, surely you have something cool in response to a cool conversation comes of it. But this is different. This is local. This is our community, and this is our lives in a way that, I only have nonfiction in this room. I was going to be like, this best-selling novel over here. But yeah, the latest Stephen King isn't going to do what this does, even if we all read it.
Yeah, it's talking to our own experiences. And I love that idea of having it spark just informal conversations. I had the opportunity as the editor to talk personally with the authors, and kind of fine-tuning their pieces. But I also had the luxury of, when I was reading submissions, I felt like everyone was talking to me. They were talking to me. They, dear editor, this is my piece. They wrote it for me. It was a discussion. It felt so personal. I had the luxury then of, once the book was all together, in my editorial note, I got to say how great it is, but I got to think about what it had done for me and how this book and the authors who contributed their own experiences helped me get a perspective on what I went through. So I would love if that happened for more people in discussions around this book as it goes forward. It's wonderful, it's liberating, it's helpful, and it creates those kind of connections that we need when we're facing disasters.
So we're running low on time, so I'm going to give my own final note, which is that I'm not faking any of my enthusiasm on this. And I will add, I was a little reluctant to be on board with this project in the beginning, because it just sounded like work and I didn't want to think about my feelings. So why would I want to deal with other people's? Which, maybe is just way too telling about who I am as a person. But none of my enthusiasm about this book is fake at all. I do marketing and I use a lot of exclamation points, and I am fortunate enough that I mean it. This book is really, really, really stellar, and I'm really excited to, finally meet these contributors and share their their work. It is such a privilege to be able to put this work out in the world. Nisty, Susan, please give me some closing thoughts and I'll move on to upcoming events. Misty, I said your name first. You got to go first.
Okay, I'm looking at Sue. I always defer to Sue here. I feel like she just knows more about everything in general. The only thing lingering in my head, and this comes from our discussion earlier, that 2020 is still with us. Am I talking over you, Sue?
I don't know, maybe you can't hear me.
Go ahead. It's all you.
Oh, I just was going to say, I'm just excited about the fact that this will be out in the world, and that we have all these events planned where the contributors will be able to share and maybe be able to interact with an audience. And I'm very excited about it.
I just want to say, as a person who has a PhD in medieval literature, if you read the editorial note, nobody has to. There's no reason you need to, but I do bring up the Black Death a lot, and I kept comparing it, and it was kind of tongue-in-cheek at the time, but the longer we get into COVID world, and the more we realize COVID will always be with us, and the more we start to see the cultural changes that have happened, I think that metaphor is probably not too far off, or not as far off as I thought. Not that it has the same mortality rate, at least we have been spared that, but this book also is capturing a cultural moment, and I'm glad we have this documentation for posterity, so it can work on an individual level and it works at a cultural community level too. So go little book, as Chaucer said. Go.
Sorry, I was trying to promote tonight's event. Very exciting. Promote it in the chat, which you're all going to hear me say now anyway, so I didn't really do. But tonight we're so lucky to be invited by Iowa City Poetry to their monthly reading series, Today You Are Perfect. We have 6 contributors headlining this event, which is crazy. And we're also going to do a teeny tiny Q&A at the end, which I am nervous about because that'll be me answering questions instead of Misty. And like I've said already, this is Sue's brainchild, but Misty is a publisher and an editor. So I think like by default, she snatched up that side of the labor. So the readers tonight are Carolyn Rambo, Philip Sturt, Lo Whittington, L.A. Fellman, Genevieve Trainer. How many people did I list? Okay, perfect. That's 6. So that's going to be really, really, really excellent. It's a poetry center. Not all of the work is proper poetry, so you have that to be excited about. I really like formal variety. But we've got a ton more coming up too in celebration of this anthology and just in general, because we're a writing center that loves being part of the world. So tomorrow, for example, we've got our annual Banned Books Week reading, where we have some literary experts, literary lovers, teachers, writers, reading from their favorite banned books. Misty will be there. I will be there. We've got a ton of people who are going to be there, so I'm not going to try and list them all, but they will include Genevieve Trainer, Mary David Saver, Lisa Powell Williams, I think. I don't have the list in front of me. I do this twice a week, and I'm never as prepared as I think I am, so I apologize for that, but it's going to be really great. That'll also be online. Both of these are going to be online events, the ones that I've mentioned so far. On Thursday, I'm going to talk about documentary writing, which is what we're doing in this book. We're documenting, right? So that'll be a fun time to join me on Write More Light. On Sunday, let's go back a day. On Saturday, this Saturday, the 2nd of October, we're going to have our bi-monthly writers workshop group. It's called Writers Studio. We meet here on Zoom at 11 a.m. The first and third Saturday of the month. So that's a really, really low pressure workshop group where we have a supportive group who are really interested in giving really good feedback. Then on Sunday, the 3rd, from 10 to 5, we will be part of the Lowland Block Party. That's at the Labor Space in Rock Island between Ragged Records and Rosdogs. And that same day at 2 p.m., Shishwin Collins, author of, see, look at this preparation, Flowing Water, Falling Flowers, will have an author reading and book signing at the Artsy Bookworm. Next Tuesday, a week from today, we're going to have a panel of anthology contributors here on Write More Light. I think that's good. I think I can stop announcing things, right? Yeah. So we're getting ready to celebrate the anniversary of the book, Flowing Water, Falling Flowers, because, you know, we already mentioned Shishwen had a her debut novel came out during a pandemic, so we have not celebrated her nearly enough. So we will do more of that. Now, Misty, we talked a little bit, maybe you are going to be mad at me for making you do it, but would you like to give our free write prompt?
I would love to. So grab your pen, grab your paper, grab your writing utensil, flex your fingers. I'm a believer in the free write. Put your pen down, you don't stop. And I want you to think and write about what of 2020 is still with you. Good, bad, neutral.
And I understand some people are going to have to go, possibly including the two of you, but I'm going to put 5 minutes on my timer on my phone, and I'm going to write it with you. As always, please, please, please write more light into your life. And I will probably talk, because I'm going to be writing with you, I'll probably talk a little bit to the computer about what I'm doing, because it's awkward being on screen silent. But you know, it's okay. Just whatever comes out is whatever comes out. 5 minutes on the clock.
Right.
Like I said, I might end up talking to the screen because now I'm explaining that I don't have the right notebook with me. So, fun time here. Like I often say, mine has absolutely turned into a journal, and that is absolutely fine. We've got about 30 seconds left.
You made me think, Sarah, about how in the personal essay workshop that we're in, so much of the journaling that the other workshoppers are doing is turning into a personal essay or memoir. So journaling is great material, a great way to get those thoughts down.
That's where all of my essays start. That, or I'm like, oh, that was a good idea. And then like, I try to force it and it doesn't go as well. Maybe I shouldn't have added that last bit. Our time is up. So thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you for sitting for 5 minutes with what was probably a little traumatic. Thank you for being part of our little writing community. As always, please write more light into your life. Thank you so much, Misty, Susan.
Thanks for letting me be here.
Thank you, everyone.